camera aperture is something that absolutely confused the heck out of me when I first got into photography about 6 or 7 months ago now. I mean, what is even an f-stop and why does it even matter? Well, after doing some research and plenty of trial and error out in the field, I think I've finally got a pretty good grasp on how to choose the best aperture for your photos. So let's dive in and let's break it down. First, let's start with the basics. Aperture is basically just the opening on your lens that allows a certain amount of light to pass through to your camera sensor. It's like the diameter of a water pipe. The bigger the pipe is, the more water can flow through it. Now, quite inconveniently, aperture, rather than measured in centimeters or inches outwards, it's measured in what's called f-stops. And counterintuitively, the lower the number of f-stop, like a f1.4, represents a larger opening versus higher numbers like f16. I know, it seems kind of weird and backwards, but you'll get used to it. So I'm going to share my amateur guide to choosing the best apertures for different situations. Now, if you want a blurry background in your photo, you know, that dreamy bokeh effect, well, you can go for a wide aperture like an f1.8 or f2.8. Essentially, you want to make the aperture of your lens as wide as it'll go. And this is great for portraits or any time you want your subject to stand out from the background. The wider the aperture, the more background blur you're going to get. Just keep in mind that with a really wide aperture, your depth of field, essentially the area that is in focus, is going to be very shallow. So make sure that you nail your focus on the subject, otherwise half of the picture is going to be blurry and you're not going to be able to see what you're supposed to be able to see. And you can think of depth of field like a wall, where wherever it covers, it's going to be in focus. The bigger the f number, so the bigger your aperture, the thicker this wall is going to be. So the more of that wall as it moves forwards and backwards in your frame as you focus in or out, the more it's going to be in focus. If you focus closer, the wall moves closer. If you focus further away, the wall moves further away. And again, the lower the f-stop or the wider the aperture, the thinner this wall becomes as it moves back and forth throughout your frame. On the other hand, if I'm shooting a landscape or a scene where I want everything to be in focus from foreground to background, I'm going to use a smaller aperture like f11 or f16. This gives me a much deeper depths of field, so everything is going to stay sharp. But just remember, the smaller your aperture, the less light is going to hit your sensor. And so you're going to have to use shutter speed to compensate for this lack of light coming in the hole, the front of the pipe of your camera, to leave that pipe open for longer to get enough light on your sensor so that you get a usable image. So if you're using a small aperture to get a deep depth of focus for your photos, you might need to use, for example, a tripod to stop camera shake as the shutter is open for a long period of time. Another thing to keep in mind is how aperture affects the overall brightness of your photo. And brightness is basically a simple term of what fancy photographers call exposure. A wider aperture will let in much more light, counterintuitive to the point that we were just talking about earlier on. You have a wider pipe, so more light in the same amount of shutter speed hits your sensor. And so wide apertures are awesome for low light situations. But the inverse of this is also true. If it's super bright out, you might want to use a smaller aperture if you have got your shutter speed set in stone to avoid overexposing your shots. And I've definitely made the mistake of shooting wide open on a sunny day and ended up with a completely washed out photo. The other way to deal with that, and especially if you're going to do any video work where you want that shallow depth of field, is to use what's called an ND filter on the front of your camera that reduces physically the amount of light coming in, so you can use a bigger pipe, have that shallow depth of field, blur out the background, and everyone is happy. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I'm not always the sharpest shooter, pun intended. But I noticed that when I use a really wide aperture like f1.8 or f2, sometimes my photos don't end up quite as sharp as I would like. And it turns out that's because of something called lens aberrations, which are basically imperfections in the lens that can cause things like color fringing or softness around the edges. And these tend to be more noticeable at wider apertures. But hey, sometimes that bit of a dreamy look can actually work in your favor. In the latest Batman film, for example, they literally smeared a bunch of crap on the outside edge of the lenses so that the middle of it is sharp, the outside is all a bit dreamy and blurry to give that comic book look. They wanted the film to be gritty. They didn't want it to be too perfectly shot. And so if that's good enough for Hollywood, then sometimes it's going to be good enough for us. Okay, this one is just a fun little bonus tip. If you're shooting straight into the sun or any other bright light source, try using a small aperture like f16 or even f22, and you'll notice that the sun starts to create a cool starburst effect, with little rays firing outwards from the center of the sun. The smaller the aperture, the more defined this starburst effect is going to be. And it's sometimes a bit kind of cliche and can be overdone, but sometimes it's a neat little way to add some visual interest to your shots. Another thing that I've recently learned is that every lens has a sweet spot, an aperture where it performs best in terms of sharpness and overall image quality. For most lenses, this is going to be between f5.6 or f8. So right in the middle of that aperture range, right in the middle of how big or small that the lens can go. So if you're not sure where to start when you're shooting, or you don't really care about your aperture, you've got enough light, you're not that focused on blurring the background, just stick it at f8 and start firing away your shots. It's very easy to get overwhelmed with all the different settings, but if you've got your camera on auto ISO, you've got a reasonable shutter speed for the movement in the scene. So obviously if you're shooting a bird in flight, it's going to be a much faster shutter speed. If you're shooting some random dude sat on a bench, it can be much smaller. Well, if they're the constraints that you find yourself in, stick the aperture in f8 and focus on your composition. Focus on all the arty stuff that actually really matters when you're taking photos. And with that said, finally, don't be afraid to experiment with different apertures to create unique effects in your photos. Let's say, for example, you want to create a sense of motion or energy. Try using a wider aperture and just pan your camera along with the moving subject. Or if you want to create what's called a miniature effect, use a tiny, tiny aperture and shoot from a high angle. It kind of makes your subject a little bit weird looking and toyish. But the point is, don't get overwhelmed with any of these settings. If you're taking a photo of something that is inherently interesting and it's framed up nicely and you're using a few compositional techniques, how blurry the background is essentially makes no difference. Heck, even how sharp everything is makes no difference. There's been plenty of photos taken over the past 100 years that are not particularly sharp, that are still masterpieces of photography. So there you go. If you want to learn about another element of photography that's been explained, click the video that's on the screen right now.